Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar for the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. I teach Tanakh at Yeshiva University, and I thank Torah in Motion for having me today as part of this big fiesta of pre-Pesach Shiurim, which is really very nice. So our topic is just our journey in the Haggadah, where we're going to look at what the Haggadah might have intended. So let's just talk about that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll plunge right on in. The Haggadah, it's kind of weird. It's in a book. I don't know what edition you use. I use different editions myself, but it's not a book. It's a reader. It's a compilation of various texts, some biblical, some rabbinic, some a little bit later, and it was put together between the 9th and the 11th centuries CE by people, presumably rabbis. It's not exactly clear, but it kind of just grew. And so that by the end of the 11th century, pretty much the structure of the Haggadah and the texts that were in it were more or less fixed. The only exception then being the songs at the end. The songs came in later. So the goal of this shiur is kind of to get into the mind of the compilers of a reader to try to figure out what experience they were hoping to achieve with us at our Seder. So here are just a few basic principles, and then we'll go through the actual Haggadah and consider the structure, what's going on, and its meaning. One thing is that the Haggadah, like the Torah and like the Talmud long before, merges laws and observance with narrative. That's something that we've been doing since the beginning of time as a people. Hashem does this in the Torah. The Talmud is constantly mixing stories with laws and laws with stories, and there's almost a seamless transition one to the other. Many codes or texts are either just the stories or just the laws, but this is an excellent blend of these two elements. That's part one. Part two is what the Haggadah itself tells us, which is vital to understanding what the purpose of the Haggadah is, that we are not just remembering some old story that happened some, I don't know, 3,300 years ago, you pick a number, somewhere in that neighborhood. We're interested in experiencing the story, and we're part of the story, and we view ourselves as though we were slaves and we are free. And we also not only talk about the ancient story of our ancestors, but we constantly bring in our own plight and pray to God for our own redemption. Okay, so that's another thing that's very important for understanding our Haggadah. Another component of the Haggadah, which is really very important, is that there's the biblical layer. God wants us to teach our children, teach one another, and recount and relive the Exodus every year. But we also are part of the Greco-Roman world. It's kind of weird how that happened, but that's just because when the sages of the Mishnah compiled the rituals and the tellings in the way that they did it for the original type of Seder that they created, they lived in the Greco-Roman period. And so from their perspective, we have to act as Greco-Roman nobles. That's, for example, why we dip twice. The child asks, why do we dip? That's why, because Greco-Roman nobles like to have appetizers. They actually had at a banquet a 3-course meal, which was very snazzy. We regular Jews typically had a 1-course meal, and we're happy just to have that. But a fancy schmancy type of person would have an appetizer course, then the main, and then a dessert, and of course accompanied by wine. So we mimic this appetizer dipped in a sauce thing to the T. We're trying to be Greco-Roman nobles. The same thing is true for reclining. 2 of the 4 questions that the child asks, there's a very basic answer. The sages who created this Seder structure did this in the Greco-Roman period. So you just picture those Julius Caesar types reclining on a couch or some kind of mat, and they're literally lying down while, and of course they recline to their left. Why? Because it is a right-handed world, folks, even though I'm left-handed and hate saying that, but I have to say it just about every single shiur that I give because it is true. It is a right-handed world. Okay, since everybody is right-handed, so you recline to the left because you're using your right hand to eat. So that's simply what you would normally do. Okay, so that's 2 of the 4 questions from the 4 questions that we have in our text. The right answer is because we are being Greco-Roman nobles. Although that's only to a point. Our sages had a very basic problem. It's actually kind of historically funny. The most popular appetizer dish for the Greco-Roman noble people at their banquets was, get ready for this, romaine lettuce dipped in a sauce. So our sages had a conundrum here. On the one hand, well, we got to act like they do, don't we? On the other hand, we don't want to use romaine lettuce early on for the appetizer course because for us, romaine lettuce is the primary maror, which fulfills a biblical command. Okay, so the way we handled that was we changed that appetizer course to use any other vegetable you want, just not romaine, please, because we want to save up our romaine for the maror part of the meal. Okay, so that's how karpas became karpas. We had to use a dipped appetizer, but we couldn't use the maror anymore because as much as Greco-Roman people like that, so do we. I love it. It's delicious. But you can't use it for the karpas appetizer because that would ritually fulfill our maror commandment, and we cannot do that. So there are times that we have to move away from the Greco-Roman format in order to fulfill our much more ancient Torah layer of observance. Okay. Here's another really interesting feature of, I don't know what the culture is like. I don't assume that everybody that I'm talking to is actually in Toronto, just because Torah in Motion is based in Toronto. You can be all over the place just like I am. So wherever you are, I don't know what your particular local culture is, but when I grew up in New York City back in the day, the culture was always you would brag, how long did your Seder go? I don't know if you have that culture where you are, but that was a big thing. People would compete, like 2 a.m, feh, I did till 3 or whatever. People would try to one up the other person. That was a rather normal part of the culture. I don't personally subscribe to this type of culture. There should be learning and ritual observance, but I don't feel any need to be completely obliterated for the rest of the holiday as a result of staying up way too late at the Seder. But okay, that's just me. But why do we do that at all? Why do we make it a priority to have at least a longer Seder? After all, if we're reliving our ancestors' exodus, guess what? They were in a hurry. They were in such a hurry that they couldn't even make provisions, that they couldn't get the dough to rise. That's why it baked on their backpacks. They got lafas that way. Okay, so why don't we rush too? And this is a more interesting question than I ever would have thought, because there was an ancient sectarian group called the Samaritans. They still exist. They're in very small numbers, but there's a very, very ancient sectarian group, the Samaritans, and they actually do rush their Pesach observance because they're imitating our ancestors. And so they're saying, oh, our ancestors rushed, we should rush too. Whereas we rabbinic Jews, following normative Judaism, say, no, we actually should take longer. Not necessarily till 3 a.m. You could do what you want to do, but definitely longer. We don't hurry. And the reason for this is because, first of all, we're Greco-Roman nobles. They don't rush their meals. They take their sweet, merry time. That's why there are courses. But on top of that, we're also thinking about the Messianic era. And there's a pasuk all the way in Sefer Yeshayahu. I'm sharing the screen. You're able to see it, right? Excellent. I believe you also received source sheets, but I never count on the fact that every single person on the Zoom received it. So it's on the screen too, but if you have it in front of you, even better. So here goes. When the final redemption comes, we will not go in haste. It's the same word that's used at the Exodus from Egypt, but the future redemption won't be in haste. And you won't be fleeing like we did in Egypt. Because God himself will be guarding you. It's going to be a much more pleasant experience than what we had in the Exodus from Egypt, where we really were in a huge rush and chariots were chasing us, and it was rather scary for a little while. The future redemption will not be like that. So we follow the policy of let's have a real Greco-Roman banquet. Let's sit like kings and queens. Let's be nobles. Let's enjoy a nice meal with wonderful food and bonus foods that you don't normally have. Let's sit and discuss. Let's learn. Let's not be in a rush. So we don't follow the Samaritan way, but the Samaritans are much closer to the biblical Exodus than we are. We're simply following the rabbinic model, which of course is what we do as rabbinic Jews. Okay. That's just background. Let's talk about the actual Seder, the way that we do it. The whole point of the Seder is that we are supposed to experience the process of our ancestors. We started off as nobles. In Yosef's time, things were looking very sweet. We were escaping a famine, but all of a sudden we were sitting pretty in Goshen, living as nobles. Everything seemed very nice. Then the old generation died out and blam, we became slaves overnight. That was terrible. And then finally, Hashem intervenes at some point close to the Exodus. Plagues, sea splits, were saved. Great. The rituals of the Seder, if you ask me, and since I'm talking, so thank you for asking, I'm just going to go for it. I believe that the rituals of the Seder are actually causing us to recreate that journey. And that's the title of the shiur, our journey in the Haggadah. So for example, let's start with the beginning. We start with Kadesh. We make Kiddush on wine. So here we are. That's already a festive thing, even year round. Whenever we have Shabbat Kiddush or any Yom Tov, it doesn't just have to be Pesach. It's already a festive free moment by enjoying a glass of wine over a nice meal. Then we recline to the left, which is again a symbol of our being noble. Some people even have the custom to have other people pour you the wine, so even if it's just another family member, so that you feel like you have servants serving you. That's super duper luxury over there. Okay. The Kiddush is definitely a sign of freedom, luxury, nobility, and all of those good things. It's basic rabbinic Judaism by having Kiddush, and it's the Greco-Roman piece as well. Lovely. We then move to Orchatz, where we do a ritual washing before a dipped vegetable. Whenever in the temple period, whenever you dipped anything in a fluid, even a donut into a cup of coffee, for example, even though there was definitely no coffee as a beverage then, and I don't know, they must have had some fried dough treat even in the ancient world. I don't know if it was the same as a donut, but let the food historians look into that one. What I care about is even for that, you would wash also without a blessing, just like what we do before we dip the karpas appetizer into vinegar or salt water or whatever you use. Okay? That's a ritual thing from the time of the temple. Some people, again, have the custom to wash other people's hands for the same thing, sign of freedom, nobility. And Netziv points out correctly, that's Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who lived in the 19th century. He was the last Rosh Yeshiva at the great Volozhin Yeshiva. Netziv argues, I think very convincingly, that at least many of us no longer practice this on a regular basis. Most of us, if we're going to dip a donut into a cup of coffee or a vegetable into some liquid or a salad dressing, whatever you like to use, we don't normally wash. Most people don't wash. Even very observant Jews no longer follow this practice in the modern era. But Netziv says that at the Seder, we're also reliving the temple experience. And therefore, there's a sign of nobility and even a taste of the temple and what it was like to live then, when obviously there was a much greater emphasis on ritual purity. Okay, so we're still in the realm of we're nobles. We had Kiddush. We're acting as though we're in the temple. People are taking care of us. It's all looking good. Then we get to the karpas, the third item on our Seder order. So again, the fact that it's an appetizer dipped in a sauce, bam. Greco-Roman nobles, we're free again. It's still being noble, free, and all of those good things. And that's certainly the primary reason why we have karpas at this juncture in the Seder. But the halachists introduced a very interesting dimension to this. In halacha, there's a problem in the structure of our Seder. We have later on, we're not even up to this yet. We have matzah, and then we're going to have maror, and then we'll have the korech, the mixture of all of these things, and then we're going to have dinner. Okay, you know the rule. This applies year round. Whenever you wash netilat yadayim and eat bread and say hamotzi, the bread covers everything that is in that meal. So it certainly, for example, will cover dinner. You don't have to make brachot, blessings, on all the different foods that you're going to eat at dinner. Cool. I like that rule. It's a good one. We do it all the time. No big deal. But the problem is, does maror count as dinner? Or are we eating maror just as a ritual food that has its own separate standing that's really not part of dinner? That's a really interesting question. I like it myself. But the ancient halachists realize that that's a problem, because if the matzah does not cover the maror, then we are obligated to say borei pri hadama. We have to say a separate blessing on the vegetable part of it before the blessing that we do say, the ritual al achilat maror. If there's a blessing that we say on the fulfillment of the commandment. But do we also make just good old-fashioned borei pri hadama? Do we make a blessing on a vegetable? The way halacha managed this is, when we eat this karpas at the beginning of the Seder, we need to have in mind the maror. This borei pri hadama will also cover the much further down the road maror. So what I like about the symbol of that is that even though we're dipping an appetizer in a sauce, whatever that liquid is, even if it's just good old-fashioned salt water, that's nobility. But halakha demands that we already start thinking about the bitterness of our slavery. We're starting to descend into slavery. We might not realize it yet. We think we're just free and noble, but sneakily, just like Paro of old enslaved us very suddenly, so too our Seder is sneakily getting slavery onto the map. And that's why it's pretty out of nowhere. The fourth ritual is the yachatz, where we break the middle matzah in half. Why do we do this? Well, the Talmud explains that when you're a slave, you don't know when your next meal is going to be. You're in dire straits. So you don't want to eat all of your food all at one time because who knows when your next meal will be. So what you do here is you break it in half and eat some now and save some for down the road just in case. How do you like that? We just became slaves. We went from being super duper noble, and before you know it, you start thinking about the maror, and blammo, the yachatz makes us slaves. All of a sudden, we're enslaved in Egypt. We're no longer noble. It's a whole different world. For the record, just as in old, when Yosef was on his deathbed and knew that the slavery was coming, he says, "Don't worry, everybody. One day God is going to redeem you." Even before the slavery begins, Yosef knows the covenant with Abraham. One day there will be a redemption. And when there is a redemption, make sure to get my bones out of here and bring them back with you. So too, Yachatz covers that. We are slaves, but the second half of the matzah is going to be used for the tzafun, which is already part of the messianic redemption part of the Seder. So just as the karpas makes us start to think about slavery, Yachatz, even though we've just descended into slavery, just like that, we have one eye on the future redemption. I think that these rituals do a magnificent job of acting out what we are supposed to be going through, the exact process of journey from nobility to slavery, that have one eye on the redemption. Okay, we now move up to the main part of the Haggadah, the Magid, which Magid just means telling the story, but we're much more than just telling the story. We're living this story. That's really what it's all about. It's really very interesting. If you ask any child, and even our Haggadah, why do we eat matzah on Pesach? Well, the Haggadah gives the right answer, which is, well, when we were leaving Egypt, we were in a hurry, and so our dough did not rise, right? That's source number 2 over here. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Okay, from that perspective, matzah is a symbol of freedom. It is a living reminder that when we were in a hurry and getting out of Egypt, part of the redemption was the matzah. Great. And later on in our Haggadah, we're going to quote this verse. Rightly so. It is the verse that the Torah gives for this element of our Seder, very important part of the mitzvah, namely matzah. Okay, but we're slaves now, right? We just broke the middle matzah. We're thinking about being slaves. We're experiencing the slavery. We're saving our next meal for later. How are we going to handle this? Very good. So the Haggadah, based on earlier midrashic antecedents, creates an amazing phenomenon. Turns out, according to the midrashic world, not only did we eat matzah upon leaving Egypt, which is a symbol of freedom, but all of a sudden, midrashically, we also ate matzah while we were slaves. We even say the very first paragraph of the Magid is this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate while still in Egypt. Because right now we're slaves. We can't say, oh, this is the matzah that we used at the time of our redemption. We're not in redemption. We're slaves right now. So suddenly we bring in this other imagery, which is not explicit in the Torah, that this is bread of affliction that we ate while we were slaves, because right now we're slaves. And this drasha, this midrash, is based on source number 3. It comes out of the Torah, where it says, you shall not eat anything leavened with it, referring to the Passover sacrifice, the Korban Pesach. For 7 days thereafter, you shall eat unleavened bread. The Hebrew is lechem oni. The pshat, the simple reading of lechem oni, just means poor bread, meaning unrisen bread. But the Midrash makes a drasha, long before the halach ma'anya in our Seder, that lechem oni could mean bread of affliction, that this was bread that we ate while we were slaves. And so the Haggadah needs that, because at the moment we are slaves. So when we begin the Magid, we're talking from the perspective of we're slaves now, and therefore this is the bread of affliction that we ate while we were in Egypt, not the bread of freedom that we eat when we were leaving. We'll save that for later, after we've already been redeemed. Okay, now we're about to tell the story, but before we do, there's a big educational interlude where the Haggadah itself wants to set out our job as religious educators for ourselves, for our family, for our company, whoever happens to be there, and just in life, not just about the Seder anymore, but for anything. So I just want to share a few highlight points from that educational interlude. The first thing is, of course, the Ma Nishtana, the 4 questions that typically the youngest child at the Seder is supposed to say. I learned it as a kid. You may have learned it as a kid too. You might teach your children that. It's all good. Children should learn this, and it's wonderful. And I'm all in favor of questioning. When you read the Talmud about the 4 questions, you realize that these questions were designed for the child who is otherwise unable to ask questions, meaning there are 4 children in the Haggadah. There's the wise one who's asking questions on his or her own. There's the wicked one who also asks questions, but in a scoffing, distanced sort of way. There's the Tam who just asks very simple questions because simple, pure soul that he is. And then there's the one who doesn't even ask. Okay, so the Talmud says we Jews ask questions. You can't even help it. Okay, so for kids who don't ask anything, here are 4 spoon-fed questions that we can give to the child to at least get this person on his or her path. And eventually they'll ask better questions. But this was the last resort. And yet, of course, we've turned that into it's part of our reader now, right? Now everybody says it. It's not that, if we ask other or better questions, now we're off the hook. The point is just to be asking questions. And that's how the Talmud frames it. All the same, because it's in a reader, it now becomes part of our ritual. So it's important just to keep our eye on the ball, that one of the major goals of our Seder is to get everybody to be engaged and to ask questions. That's really what it's all about. Okay. Another story that quickly brings that home is the idea of these 5 rabbis who stay up all night and lose track of time to the point where their students have to go knock, knock, knock. Rabbis, with all due respect, it's morning, it's time to say Shema. That is an excellent model of anybody who learns knows this to be true. The more you learn, the more exciting it gets, and also the more you realize how little you know. It's not that, the more you learn, the more you know in our tradition. It's the other way around. People who know very little typically think they know, whereas people who learn a lot realize, oh my goodness, the sea is so vast. We know the tiniest drop, and it's endlessly expanding. So these 5 rabbis really represent that pinnacle of it. Here you have 5 of the greatest rabbis of that time, if not of all time. And they're just lost discussing the story of the Exodus. What? They didn't know it? Are you kidding me? Of course they knew it. They knew it very, very, very well. That's why they stayed up all night. It's really an excellent model to all of us that, okay, there's so much more to learn. Look what they were able to do to the point where they lost track of time. There's another really nice anecdote, which I find very meaningful in the context of the Haggadah, where this Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I'm 70-ish years old. I've been trying my whole life to convince all the other rabbis to accept a certain ruling of mine, but I couldn't do it. They never bought in until somebody named Ben Zoma came up with some midrash that worked and convinced everybody. I like that story because Ben Zoma, who himself was a great sage, but he wasn't the number one. He's not even called rabbi. He was definitely a much lesser figure than Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was the head of the Sanhedrin of that time. And the Haggadah, by quoting this excerpt, to me very much is letting us know, don't think that the most learned people always teach the less learned people. Everybody learns from everybody. And the idea that Rabbi Elazar just very candidly points out, he says, look, I'm the top gun of my generation, but I couldn't convince anybody of what I was trying to convince him. A much lesser figure did that. That's obviously very encouraging to all of us. Ben Zoma, by the way, is also the teacher in Pirkei Avot who says in source 4, Ben Zoma said, who is wise? One who learns from everyone. It's nice that Ben Zoma, the same player in our Haggadah, is the one who teaches everybody. Wisdom isn't about knowing the most. Wisdom is about learning from everybody. It's a learning process. That's something that our Haggadah highlights very, very, very strongly. Okay, so those are just a few of the highlights of the educational interlude. Now we can go back to living the story. So you may recall, we're slaves right now. We just had the bread of affliction. We've already broken the middle matzah in half as a means of saving up some food for later. Okay, we're ready to move on with the story. So the Talmud tells us that we must begin our story with the negative stuff and then move on to the positive stuff. We can't just say, Ra Ra Sis Boom Ba, God redeemed us, thank you. We have to relive the whole experience, which includes the negative stuff. So our Haggadah quotes 2 biblical passages, neither from the book of Exodus. There are 2 surveys. One is at the very end of the book of Joshua, and one is in the book of Deuteronomy. So I excerpted more than what you find in the Haggadah so you can appreciate what our Haggadah is doing. This is actually what convinced me years ago that the Haggadah itself is trying to pull us along on the journey that I'm trying to describe. It was these two passages. Because, as you know, when you excerpt a passage for a reader, you could decide how much or how little to put in. And I'm very interested in how the creators of our Haggadah chose what to put in and where to stop the story. So here goes. Book of Joshua. Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned Israel's elders and commanders, magistrates, and officers, and they presented themselves before God. Now we're up to what we actually read in our Seder. We do not read that first verse, but then we go. Then Joshua said to all the people, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, in olden times your forefathers, Terach, father of Abraham and father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods." For the record, for all the wonderful midrashim about Terach and Abraham, this is actually the first time in Tanakh that you learn with certainty that Terach was an idolater. There's no mention of that in the book of Breshit when he comes up. But I had no reason to know what his religious slant was. But here we finally hear outright, he was an idolater. Okay. But I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates and led him through the whole land of Canaan and multiplied his offspring. Okay. So far, a good story. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir as his possession, while Yaakov and his children went down to Egypt. That's where our Haggadah stops. That's why I put a paragraph break there in the source, so you can see that. Our Haggadah stops with Esau got Seir, which is in southeast of Israel. It's what we call the land of Edom in Tanakh. And then Yaakov and his children went down to Egypt. Here's what our Haggadah cuts out, which you can appreciate a lot. Then I sent Moshe and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with the wonders that I wrought in their midst, after which I freed you. Hey, folks, this is the story of Pesach. Wouldn't this be the main thing that our Haggadah would want to quote, much more than the background stuff? Why in the world does our Haggadah pause the story in front of the story, right? And then I freed you. I freed your fathers from Egypt, and you came to the sea. That's part of the Pesach story. But the Egyptians pursued your fathers to the Sea of Reeds with chariots and horsemen. They cried out to the Lord. He put darkness between you and the Egyptians. Then he brought the sea upon them, and it covered them. Your own eyes saw what I did to the Egyptians. Hey, if I were making the reader, I might have wanted this paragraph way more than the other one. This is the paragraph about the Egypt experience. Moshe and Aaron, the plagues, Kriyat Yamsuf, the splitting of the Red Sea, the redemption. Great. So we cut all that stuff out and we just include up to it. Why? This is actually what convinced me of the whole thing. Okay, because we're not up to this part of the story yet. We just got to Egypt and we just became slaves. We're not up to the redemption yet. We're currently experiencing slavery. We are slaves. If you would read this paragraph, suddenly we're free, but we're not free yet. Our Haggadah wants us to pause on being slaves first. Okay? So this to me was the kicker of the whole thing. I remember years ago when I just looked at this chapter, I'm like, holy moly, it's amazing what the Haggadah is doing. It pauses at a spot that is so counterintuitive. That's because that's where we're up to in our experience of journey, going through this reader that our compilers, our rabbinic compilers in the 9th to 11th centuries, this is what they wanted us, I believe, to feel. Okay. So that's paragraph number 1 that we read in our Haggadah. Then we quickly do what our Haggadah constantly does. It oscillates between then and now. So we talk about how God redeems us in every generation. It's not just the generation of the Exodus, but rather Hashem should also redeem us. We say that God redeems us in every generation. That's part of making the experience of so long ago directly relevant to us. Okay, so that's paragraph 1 of the 2 that we read. We then read the lengthy paragraph that's in Devarim, chapter 26. This is the confession. Back in the good old days, when you were a farmer, you would bring your first fruits, called the Bikurim, to what became Jerusalem and the central shrine and the temple, and you would make a certain proclamation upon handing over your Bikurim. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. Okay, so this is what we read in the Haggadah. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. Okay, we read this in the Haggadah. The way we do it in the Haggadah structure is we read one verse, then a pile of midrashim on that. Then we go to the next verse, read a pile of midrashim on that. and so on. And the Midrashim elaborate and give us an opportunity to tell the story. Okay, so here we just notice how this story picks up exactly where our reader left off. Yaakov went to Egypt. Okay, so here we are in Egypt. Now we've become a great nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. Okay, here's the slavery. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Okay, now it's time for some redemption. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, by signs and portents. Okay, so here we go. There's your Exodus. God is plaguing the Egyptians. Now we're being redeemed. This is the moment in our Seder where we experience the redemption. And that's where we stop. And the Haggadah cuts off there. It does not read the next couple of verses. He brought us to this place, referring to Israel, and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's true, but in our Seder, we're not in Israel. We just got out of Egypt. And that's where the Haggadah is going to stop the story, right? This story pauses here. Now we've just gotten our redemption. We've gotten out of Egypt. And so that's where it's going to pause. We're not going to Israel yet. And so that is that. I can stop sharing because there are no more sources in the source sheet that we need. Everything else we could just do. So the Haggadah, by selectively cutting and pasting exactly where it needs, perfectly sets up this journey. One other thing, I guess I don't have the screen anymore, but in that source that's relevant to the Haggadah specifically is that it talks about us. It doesn't talk about our ancestors were in Egypt. Hashem redeemed us. Of course, that's the whole theme of the Seder. And so this paragraph becomes incredibly important for just conveying how you and I are supposed to feel as we go through this journey. Okay. We now get up to what I always found, and I still find, the weirdest part of the whole Haggadah. This is where our sages start bargaining over how many plagues there were at the Red Sea. After we talk about the 10 real plagues that were in Egypt that we know about, the sages start making drashot on, they come up with homiletical interpretations where they try to magnify how many plagues there were at the Red Sea. So they start, do I hear 50? Okay, 50. 200, great. I can do better than that. 250. All right. So that was the part of the Haggadah that I never quite understood, not as a child and even as a young adult. I'm still a young adult, but a younger adult, for the simple reason that I didn't think there were any plagues at the Red Sea. I think the thing that really made it bad for the Egyptians was the drowning part. You don't need any other plagues after that. You're really good. Hashem did what he needed to do. He got rid of the chariotry and he redeemed the people of Israel. You don't need to heap on further woes onto the Egyptians. The drowning part was good. It did the job. It was done. And we're really done. So that part of the Haggadah always I found puzzling. So I remember when my father first bought the old Bar Ilan University CD-ROM, the Responsive Project. He bought version 2.0. I personally now own version 21, and that's very out of date, but I don't care because 21 has more than I could ever hope to need. So I don't care what version they're even up to now. As long as my thing works, I'm a happy guy. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. It's incredible how much they could pack onto what's now a key. It used to be a CD-ROM, now it's a key, or who knows, maybe the newer versions are even something different. I don't know, but I'm a happy guy with this key. It just stays on my computer at all times, and I use it all the time. It's an excellent resource. Okay, so back when it was Bar Ilan version 2, so for me, this was like a really fun toy. I'm like, wow, look how much stuff is on this one circle. For me, it's a miracle. I don't know the first thing about computers, but I learned how to use the programs that I need, like that one, because I was like, this is amazing. You could just conjure up just about any text that you will ever need. And since then, they've added so many more text and just better searching ability than they used to have back in the good old days. So I looked these paragraphs up. So I'm like, I have this thing now. I can figure out where they're actually from. They're not from the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a reader quoting it from somewhere, but I didn't know from where. It's not in the Talmud. That much I knew, but I didn't know where it was coming from. So the answer is, according to Bar Ilan CD-ROM version 2.0, I mean, this is true. You can look it up yourself on any version or just look it up in a book. It's from Midrash Tehillim, the Midrashic collection on the book of Psalms. And it comes from Midrash Tehillim on Psalm 78. 78 is an important psalm in the sense of, out of the 150 psalms, the way that we count them in our book of Psalms, there are 3 of those that I would call historical psalms, meaning they're actually surveys of ancient history with a religious purpose. It's not just to remind us of history. Here's what our ancestors did, and here's what God did, and here's what we need to do. The point is always the we need to do part. So Psalm 78 is the first of those three. The other two, for the record, are 105 and 106. If you just want to look them all up, you can see them yourself. So 78 is about, here's the theme. It's a very lengthy psalm, but it's one point, because that's what the psalms do in this situation. The point is, God has done a lot of truly incredible things all the time for us and our ancestors, and we stink. We are constantly ungrateful, and we sin, and God did this miracle, and we sinned, and then God did that miracle, and we sinned. And the message of the psalm, in case you were wondering, is you and I, the current reciters of this psalm, should be a lot more grateful and righteous than our ancestors were. We should appreciate what God has done and what God does, and we should be more grateful. So that's the gist of the psalm. Okay. Midrash Tehillim and gathers all kinds of midrashim pertaining to the stories that the psalmist recounts, where the goal is to magnify the miracles of God even more. Example, the man or the manna, when you look at the Torah, the man tasted like one thing. It tasted like, imagine if you have a honey jar and you leave it slightly open, so now the top gets kind of crystalline. Sounds delicious. I mean, it is delicious when you do that with the honey jar. But that's what the man was like. It was basically just honey-y, sweet, sticky, with that crispy little crystal thing in there. Yum. I mean, you might get tired of it, having it 3 meals a day for 40 years, which is why the Torah has to bend over backwards to even say that they would fry it sometimes and they would cook it sometimes, eat it straight sometimes. I imagine the tribe of Zevulun, which is known for its business-like entrepreneurial spirit, I have little doubt that the Sisterhood Auxiliary of Zevulun wrote a cookbook, 101 ways to serve man, and they sold it, and it was probably a bestseller in the desert. Some version of that. And it would have been a great idea, because everybody needed some new idea, because you would get otherwise very tired of it, as the people sometimes did. Okay. But it's great. Okay, well, in the Midrash, and this is always like a great thing to do with nursery school kids, the Midrash, which is assembled on Psalm 78, imagines that man could taste like anything you wanted it to taste like. That's even better. I mean, it's already pretty good for God to supply 40 years worth of this man, even with the crystalline honey thing, every day. But imagine if it could taste like anything you want. Wow, that's really awesome. So, of course, it's good for nursery school kids, because you could teach them this midrash and then have them draw, what would you have the man taste like, which is just a funnier way of asking, what's your favorite food, right? So it's a good thing for kids to do when they make their pancakes or their jelly beans or whatever. It's very rarely just crystalline honey, even though that would be very yummy in its own right. Okay, so that's what the Midrash does. It magnifies the miracles so that they're even more impressive, if you can imagine such a thing, from the way the Torah portrays them, which just makes us look even more ungrateful. Okay, in that spirit, well, the splitting of the Red Sea is pretty impressive in itself. I don't need any embellishment. I'm really very satisfied that God did a spectacular job redeeming our ancestors and getting rid of those evil chariots that were trying to kill us. Okay. But imagine if you have a bunch of rabbis saying, let's make that one bigger too. Okay, 50, 200, 250. In the context of Midrash Tehillim, based on what the psalm is about, you understand. Again, they're magnifying the miracle to teach how ungrateful our ancestors were. Wow, they were even more ungrateful than I thought. And that just highlights to us how grateful we need to be, which is why we follow this seemingly random midrashic excerpt with the Dayenu, which is an ancient song that was not originally written for the Haggadah, but it was incorporated, because the whole point is we're grateful for every step of the way. We've learned the message of the psalm, right? It makes total sense. The architects of our Haggadah reader knew exactly what they were doing, obviously, and they're trying to create this sense of gratitude. Oh, and then as a bonus, the gratitude takes us from Hotzianu Mimitzrayim, we're up to the Exodus, right? And it takes us on the next part of the journey, which goes all the way to entry to the land of Israel and the building of the temple, right? Just go through the Dayenu. You will see those are the steps, 15 steps, starting with the Exodus, which is what we were up to. And it carries us all the way into Israel and even to build the temple. Oh, so now the temple is built. Great. Now it's time to have the Seder. That's where we say Pesach Matzah Maror. Right? We have a temple. So let's actually go through the rituals that we say at the temple. The only thing is, we have to sadly remember, okay, there isn't really a temple, which is why we have to say that This is what our ancestors ate when there was a temple, because we obviously do not have this Korban Pesach. We do have the matzah and maror. And so that's what we do. We're having the rituals that we would have had exactly in the temple. We're exactly up to that part of the Seder. And then we could say Hallel. Because thank you, God, you've redeemed us. You've brought us to Israel. You've built the temple. Now we could actually sing the Hallel. And we say the first two paragraphs of the Hallel, which are pure praise because we're very, very happy. And then one of my favorite features of the Haggadah actually is the blessing at the end of the Magid, where we say, Asher ge'alanu v'ga'al et avotenu. Thank you, God, for redeeming us and redeeming our ancestors. If you've really gone through this journey properly, you realize we've been redeemed even more than our ancestors were at this Seder. It's amazing that we prioritize our own redemption in the blessing ahead of that of our ancestors, but that's exactly the point of our whole Seder. So I think it's really a fabulous a component of that. Just one other bonus. This is actually just a cool evolutionary thing. That was the journey, by the way. The rest of the Seder is just about our own redemption. We have our festive meal, and then we turn to praying for our own redemption. God should punish our enemies. Eliyahu and Avi should come. And then we say the Hallel, the rest of the Hallel, some of which is praising God, but some of which is petitioning God. The second half of the Hallel is not pure praise because we're not purely redeemed. And so the whole rest of our Seder revolves around God, please redeem us for real. Yes, we've gone through this journey, but now we actually really need redemption. And that's really how the rest of the Seder goes. Fun bonus point, and then I'm going to turn it over for questions and comments. I see there are a couple things on the Zoom or on the chat already, and I haven't looked at them yet. I figured I would just do my spiel first to make sure we do it, and then I could turn it over to you. The word afikoman. The word afikoman conjures up very happy thoughts for many, many, many. A lot of children either steal it or you hide it and they find it, or they hide it and you don't find it, and then they get a prize. It's a really wonderful part of our Seder. The way that we use the term afikoman, we use that to refer to that piece of matzah that we eat at the end, right? In the Safun segment of the Haggadah, right before we do Barech, which is Birkat HaMazon, we eat the afikoman. The only thing is that is certainly not how our sages of the Mishnah use the term. Because the last Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim says, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. You're not allowed to do afikoman, whatever that means, after you eat the Korban Pesach. So afikoman used to be something that we're not allowed to do. Whereas, of course, this piece of matzah that we're eating right now is mandatory. It's not an optional snack at the end of the Seder. That's a necessary component of the Seder. So we have changed the meaning of the term significantly. So the Talmud in Masechet Pesachim, where else, they discuss, well, what does afikoman mean? So you know what it meant originally? You know, we're Greco-Roman nobles. That's the whole structure of the Seder for us. Well, Greco-Roman nobles did some things that we're trying very hard to emulate. Appetizers, dipping it in a sauce, reclining, 4 cups of wine, courses in a meal. Those are the things that we do. But you see, those Greco-Roman nobles didn't stop there. After they were done with their banquet, what they would then do is crash on somebody else's banquet and drink even more. They would have drunken revelry through the night. That's what afikoman means. Afikoman is this extra drunken revelry where you crash other people's banquets and just keep right on drinking. And so our sages say in the Mishnah, yes, we're being Greco-Roman nobles, but don't be that noble. Don't act like the Greco-Roman nobles, because they're being, at this point, totally over any Jewish line of what's considered appropriate conduct. So the drunken revelry that takes place after the banquet, don't do that. I can't even imagine wanting to do that. I don't know about you. When I'm done with my Seder, I am ready to hit the sack. I couldn't imagine going out and visiting somebody's house, even to learn more Torah, right? Let alone the drunken revelry thing, but go figure. But I guess the Greco-Romans had a lot of energy when it came to this stuff. So our sages, Chazal, say, we draw the line here. This is where we stop being Greco-Romans and we start being good, righteous Jews who don't act this way. So that's what afikoman meant back in the good old days. That's Rav's opinion. But Rav seems to be correct, that this is actually what afikoman meant in its origin. In later generations, when we no longer lived in the Greco-Roman period, afikoman. Hang on, I could do something about that. Yes, power of the host. Okay, so in the meantime, getting back over to the main issue at hand. Afikoman evolved to a different thing. Once there were no longer Greco-Roman nobles floating around, and the rabbis were primarily concentrated in Babylonia, so they changed the meaning of the term afikoman to what you and I would call dessert. And you're still not allowed to have that dessert. The point is, after you eat, back in the good old days, Korban Pesach, and nowadays that last piece of matzah, which is not called afikoman, that's just the last piece of matzah, that should be the lingering taste in your mouth. Don't now go and eat something different. So afikoman it was started off as just drunken revelry after the banquet. Now it becomes dessert. And we're not allowed to have that dessert. The point is, once we finish that piece of matzah, we don't eat any more solid food. We still follow that rule. It was not until the 13th century that, for reasons that I don't understand, but that's how it went, rabbis started referring to that piece of matzah as the afikoman. So it's been going on for quite a while. We don't have to feel bad about calling this thing the afikoman. It's been going on for many centuries by now. For some reason, we've completely morphed the whole concept to that piece of matzah, which I guess in the old days was just that last piece of matzah, whatever it was that we have to eat as part of our Seder ritual. Now that thing is called the afikoman, and obviously we do eat it, right? But it's just important to see how a lot of these ideas and concepts have evolved. So just to summarize, the point of the shiur is to try to set out what, at least in my mind, is my best stab at what the compilers of our Haggadah from the 9th to the 11th centuries, what they were trying to help get us to experience by selecting the texts and positioning them the way that they did. They included certain things and cut them off right where they did in order to bring us along this journey from nobility to a sudden descent into slavery to being slaves for a while, and then suddenly, bit by bit, we're redeemed from Egypt. Then we are taken to Israel. Then we get to build the temple. Once we're in the temple, then we can A, do the rituals, but also B, be reminded of the fact that we don't have a temple, and then we go on and pray for our own redemption. So that Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim. On that happy note, I saw that there were things in the chat. So let's go there first. What if you were left-handed? Nobody's left-handed. Come on, who dreams of such a thing? Anyway, well, I am. My grandmother of blessed memory, she was born left-handed. She still grew up in a world where they trained her to be right-handed. It's not so long in world history that we lefties were allowed to live as lefties. So the truth is, halakha recognizes that left-handed people might want to recline to the right if they actually recline. And the rule is that if a left-handed person does that, it counts. Whereas if a right-handed person reclines to the right, it does not count. So halakha recognizes that even though the real ritual is we all recline to the left, and that's what I do also, but if I made a mistake and reclined to the right, that would be okay because I am left-handed. It would be a nod to the fact that in the ancient world, if you actually practiced as a lefty, that's what you would have done, because it would have been a lot less awkward to eat that way. One cool update on the reclining thing, which I think is fascinating. One place where the Haggadah the Seder could have evolved but didn't. You know, I'm not always in touch with every latest cutting edge technological development. I'm not. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I find out about it. It's usually very cool. Good for them. But here's one that I know about because it's been around for quite some time now. It's called a chair. To anybody who actually sits in a chair at a dining room table instead of reclining on a mat or a sofa like the Greco-Roman nobles did, or certain Jewish communities worldwide reclined also when they ate. But many of them have long since stopped that and sit in chairs. You know as well as I know that going like this is not a sign of freedom, and in fact, it's somewhat uncomfortable. I would way rather sit straight. I mean, yes, there is a benefit, which is that in nursery school, kids can now make little stuffed pillows for their parents and stuff. It's a great art project, so there's a benefit. But that all being said, I would happily waive the benefit and just sit straight were I allowed to do so, because for me, that feels a lot freer than reclining to left or right or anywhere. So it happens that there were two great rabbis in 12th and 13th century Germany that ruled that way. They actually said we should not lean anymore if we sit in chairs. Obviously, if you sit on the mats and recline on mats or sofas, then of course, continue to do the ancient practice. But they ruled that if you sit in a chair at a table, you should sit straight because it's no longer a sign of freedom. That view was entirely overruled, meaning Rav Yosef Karo, when he surveys the various opinions, he quotes them and he says, lovely, but we don't follow that. You must recline, even in a chair. And that, of course, is the law. And there was one moment in our history where there was a chance to make some headway on a particular ritual, but Rav Yosef Karo said no. It is hardwired into our tradition that we recline. It is mandatory, and in fact, one who has the 4 cups of wine or matzah and does not recline has to do it over again, unless that person will get sick. Okay, so those are the mandatory reclinings of the Seder. Everything else, it's optional, so you don't have to do all the whole Seder reclining, but those things require this is gonna be hard to say, require reclining. Get it? Okay. I'm sorry that I just saw this comment about the text being larger. I thought it was pretty large on my screen, but I'm sorry if it came out smaller on yours. I just saw this comment now. Okay. Now, so I'm done with that part of the spiel, and I could turn it over to, if there are other comments, questions, you can either send it on the chat or you can signal me with your Zoom hand. I think it's probably the best way to go. And I'll see if I could keep up with you. If not, I'll share one other cool evolution of a symbol that's really interesting to me. Uh, okay, so here it goes. Why do we eat maror on Pesach? So it's a Torah commandment. Maror is part of the hardwired rigged mitzvah from Hashem, and that we were supposed to have the korban Pesach, typically lamb. You were allowed to use kid also of the goat variety, with matzah, and also maror. So the Korban Pesach, we understand, that is reminiscent of the original Korban Pesach, where the Israelites had to slaughter the lamb, put the blood on the doorposts, and then during the plague of the firstborn, God passed over our homes and went right after those Egyptians. Okay, so the Korban Pesach certainly is a very important reminiscence and reliving of that event. Matzah, bam, that's the Exodus. We talked about that already. But maror, no reason is given in the Torah. It's simply what we eat with the lamb and the matzah. It's kind of all mixed into one sandwich, right? Okay. But the Torah does not give a reason for that. Our Haggadah has created this reason based on an ancient midrash. Excuse me. Sorry, one second. Which is a great midrash. I love it myself. That since no reason is given by the Torah anyway, this is easy. All you have to do is quote a pasuk at the beginning of the book of Shemot, "Vayimareru et chayehem." The Egyptians embittered the lives of the Israelites through the slavery. And so that drasha is the one that wins. That's the one we quote in our Haggadot. Why do we eat maror? Because of the bitterness of slavery. We all know that from the time we're kids. Great. But that's probably not the original reason for the eating of maror. That's simply the reason that's given by the Tanaim. In this case, it's Rabban Gamliel. It's a great midrash that became the reason that we use in our Seder. There was a great commentary in 18th century Morocco. He's known by the book he wrote called Or Hayyim. That's Rabbi Hayyim ben Attar. He wrote really one of the celebrated commentaries on the Torah that's in the standard Mikraot Gedolot editions. So his real name is Rabbi Hayyim ben Attar. He lived in 18th century Morocco. So he wrote a commentary that's quite widely read called the Or Hayyim. He was a great mystic, a tremendous midrashist, and a really fabulous commentary. Sometimes he has some insights that nobody else thought of before him. So I like to quote him when I teach Torah in that capacity. So he gets involved with this maror question. And he gives a very interesting proposal, which is probably spot on correct, which is, have you ever had a lamb wrap or shawarma even? Aren't you going to put on some kind of harif or amba or mustard? You pick your condiment. It makes it yummier. That's it. According to the Or Hayyim, the reason why God wanted us to have maror on this wrap is because it makes it taste better and we'll enjoy the mitzvah more. That's from the great midrashist and mystic. I think it's spot on. So that's his argument. He thinks that the original Torah meaning for the maror is that it simply makes the mitzvah taste yummier. Okay, so that's the biblical side of things, according at least to Rabbi Hayyim ben Attar. Then you have the Greco-Roman piece. The Greco-Roman piece, the reason why we have maror is because that's what Greco-Romans liked. They liked romaine lettuce. It was their favorite appetizer. They had it dipped in a sauce. This was a sign of nobility, like a good salad with a dressing course. Okay, so that's what maror and charoset really is. It's delicious. I mean, I know we're supposed to remember the bitterness, But I don't know, I'm sure you have a good charoset recipe too. But even just the basic chopped up apples and wine and walnuts and stuff, it's fantastic, or almonds, whatever you like to use. It's fantastic. And it's supposed to be fantastic because we're Greco-Roman nobles. And so we're just enjoying this amazing, amazing component of a nobility thing. So the original maror in the Torah is yummy. The original rabbinic maror, which is the same eating, but we've already added another layer of meaning, is that this is part of nobility. But then it became a sign of bitterness, which is why we have this weird paradox of ritual. Here we are dipping the maror in a yummy sauce because we're nobles, but we're also using it as our symbol of bitterness. It's a really cool paradox that we've created because of these different layers of meaning. This is picked up perfectly in the law of reclining for the maror. The Talmud says, the Talmud already knows that we treat it as a sign of bitterness. It already was a sign of bitterness. So it says we are not obligated to recline for maror. And that's the law. We don't have to recline for the maror. But by the time of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, he says, we do not recline for the maror, because of course for him already it's a sign of bitterness. Why in the world would you recline? The whole point of reclining is that's nobility. So we don't recline. But the original law was it's optional. You could recline. Why not? Still noble stuff. But you don't have to because we've already incorporated the sign of bitterness. That's just another example of many. I love learning the different layers of how the Haggadah and even the rituals. Maror originally was a Torah commandment. Absent the temple, it's a rabbinic law. It's not a Torah law to eat maror as an independent mitzvah according to Torah law, but it's a rabbinic law. We do it, and it's a law. We say the bracha on it. But that all said, the symbol has significantly evolved over time. So I hope that this was just a little taste of the journey through the Haggadah, at least as I perceive it, that the compilers of the Haggadah wanted to do. And while we're at it, the study of a few of the rituals and how they started off one way and over the millennia came to mean different things. I want to thank all of you for coming today, taking time out of your very busy pre-Pesach schedules just to learn. I think that's the way to fly. So good for you. I want to again thank Torah in Motion, Rabbi Kelman, for inviting me to participate in this. It's a real privilege to be able to learn with people who want to learn. I want to wish everybody Moadim L'Simcha / Chag Kasher V'Sameach. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful and meaningful Pesach. And God willing, we will learn again in some capacity in the future. So thank you very much and take care.